Hey everyone, Andy here. I just want to put in a quick plug for the new channel Eyes On. Now, previously we fell under Team House and we shared subscribers, and what we're doing here is branching off, still within the Team House franchise. But it is important that we build up steam with our own subscription base. So please, cost you nothing, click on the subscribe button. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Eyes On. And this week it's just me as the host, but to make up for that, we have a tremendous guest, Jasmine El-Gamal, who I count as a friend. She has served for 25 years in public and private sector organizations covering issues related to national security, including as a consultant to the U.S. Department of Defense, the UN, and the European Union. And I'm going to talk a little bit about her role in the Pentagon, which is especially impressive. She served as special assistant to three consecutive undersecretaries of defense for policy at the Pentagon, where she advised on national security issues, but particularly in relation to the Middle East. And during this period, also, she served as a translator and cultural advisor in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And if we have time at the end, Jasmine, I would love to hear, some of your thoughts about that now looking back. While in government, she won a bunch of awards for her contributions to policy formulation and real awards too, I might add. After leaving the Pentagon, she went into think tank land. She was a fellow at the Atlantic Council, a visiting fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations, and she's written and appeared extensively. I'm not going to list all the publications, but everything from Washington Post, USA Today, Newsweek, Times, CNN, Al Jazeera, where she just came from, also European media and media across the Middle East. And she's also founder and CEO of an organization called MindWorks, which advises organizations, primarily businesses, but any organizations and individuals on crafting empathy-based, culturally driven approaches to policy, strategic communications, and workplace mental health, which is, mental health has been a topic close to her heart as it is to mine. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about that at the end, Jasmine, if we have time. She hosts her own podcast, Mind Work with Jasmine El-Gamal, where she talks about exactly that, mental health in the workplace. Jasmine, welcome. It's great to see you again, and it's good to have you on board. And by the way, she's in DC now, but heading back to London, which is my hometown. So I hope to run into her again soon there. Jasmine, great to have you. I think, in the immediate aftermath of the US elections, I would love to hear your thoughts on how Arab Americans voted and why. What kind of and I know that's an absurd generalization, but what kind of the trends and perceptions that shaped how they voted?
Of course. And thank you so much, Andy, for having me. And it's really good to see you. It's been a while since we've spoken, and I think a lot has happened since then. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. In regards to your first question about Arab Americans, I think this is a really interesting topic. And there are a few different angles, I guess, I would like to go into when it comes to that. I think, first of all, I think it's important to just note, and I know a lot of people know this, but we often have found in the media people talking about Arab and Muslim Americans as sort of a monolithic group, that they're going to vote one way or they feel a certain way about a certain issue, when in fact, actually, there have been and always have been a wide variety of opinions and priorities within that community. Many Muslims in the US are not Arab, in fact. They're Asian. Many Arabs in the US are not Muslim. They're Christian, they're Chaldean, they're Assyrian. So it's just it's a vibrant, diverse, and complicated and complex set of communities. So with that caveat aside, I guess I would say that obviously one of the main issues at the top of the agenda for many Arab and Muslim Americans this last year has been the war on Gaza and the war in Lebanon in more recent months. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict writ large, but particularly the war over the last year that of course was kicked off by Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th in Israel or against Israel. And so a lot of people in that community had been very hurt and frustrated at the Biden administration's, not only their policies and what they saw as unconditional support to Israel as it violated human rights law, international law, and just they were, as we all were, watching the most horrific scenes across our televisions and social media for the last year. And a lot of the community really felt that the Biden administration not only was enacting harmful policies that were detrimental to the security of the region, but also that the Biden administration wasn't paying attention to those voices within the Arab and Muslim communities that were asking for meetings, that were trying to share their thoughts, offer their advice, try to impact those policies in some way. It wasn't until really late in the game, when Biden was still running for president, that he eventually sent some of his team members to Michigan to talk to the community there. And of course, by that point, it was sort of almost too late. Like, it's so obvious that this is an election-related issue, that you're just meeting with us to check a box. That's how they were feeling.
And
so
and also he sent his team members, but he didn't go himself.
right.
Is that correct? And
yeah,
and
of course.
and some criticism from Dearborn too, that Kamala Harris didn't do much better in that regard in talking directly to them.
Exactly. That's what and that's what I was coming to. So by the time that Biden stepped aside and Kamala Harris became the nominee, there was already this real kind of reservoir of frustration and anger and disappointment and hurt, feeling really dehumanized, feeling unimportant, feeling like their voices didn't matter as Americans, not as Arabs, but as Americans, as voters. And so, although Kamala Harris began her campaign talking about this issue in a much more notably more empathetic way than President Biden had spoken about it, I mean, if you remember, President Biden early on famously questioned the death toll in Gaza, constantly feeling like he was focusing on the Israeli side and not really tapping into that Arab pain, that Palestinian pain. So when Kamala Harris came in, there was a notable shift in that rhetoric. You could see more empathy, you could see more discussion and acknowledgement of Palestinian suffering, of civilian casualties. There was a speech that she gave in Selma, Alabama, where she talked about it in detail, really kind of humanizing people in the Middle East and particularly Palestinians in Gaza. So there was I would say, sense of optimism early on that she could be different. But I think what we saw throughout the campaign was that Harris was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that, she was vice president, so she was part of the administration that was enacting these policies that were angering Arab and Muslim Americans, or at least many of them. She was also a candidate that was trying to win an election, and with all of the politicking that comes with that. So there was really, I think her team made a decision that she was not to differentiate herself too much from Biden, that she was not to step out ahead and say things that might lose certain other demographics, whether it was, the Jewish vote or the larger pro-Israel vote, which includes Christian evangelicals as well in the US. So what ended up happening was a really watered down campaign when it came to the issue of Gaza, not really saying much, kind of repeating the same refrain over and over again. End the war, release the hostages. Felt very empty. It felt very inauthentic. And of course, there was a blow during the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, when, despite huge efforts, advocacy efforts, and and engagement by Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, Palestinian Americans, that the campaign decided not to allow a Palestinian American speaker onto the stage, whereas they allowed the parents of the late Hirsch Goldberg Polin, his parents, Rachel and John, who are incredible human beings. And actually, they went on that stage, and their son had not been tragically murdered yet. And they gave an incredibly moving address. And they actually mentioned the suffering in Gaza as well. And a lot of people were really grateful for them to that. I mean, they really are incredible, incredible people. And so all of that basically culminated in the Arab American and Muslim American vote as it relates to Gaza, kind of splintering. It split. Some of them did, said there's no way I can vote for Harris. A, she was part of the Biden she is part of the Biden administration. B, she hasn't shown us any reason to vote for her. She hasn't given us any hope that she will change her policies if she were to become president. So you had people who said we're not voting for her. You had people who said we're voting for Jill Stein, which ended up actually being not that many people at all. Jill Stein polled terribly. I think 0.4% at the end. You had people who just didn't vote at all, who said, we don't feel included in this democratic process. You obviously don't care about us. You don't value our lives. And so we're not going to vote at all. And then, of course, you had the Arab and Muslim Americans who decided to vote for Trump. Now, I've spoken to some of them, and there are, of course, various reasons also why they would vote for Trump. It's not only about Gaza. Some people voted for Trump because he said he would end wars in the Middle East. Some people voted for Trump because of that social values, because generally that community is more socially traditional. So they voted based on things like they believed, that their family values closer aligned with the Republican Party than with the Democratic Party, and so on. And so I guess, what I'm really trying to say is the community didn't vote in one way. The vote was really cast, along a wide range of issues, but certainly the Gaza, the wars in Gaza and Lebanon and the wider Israel-Palestine conflict was one of the main factors in many people's decisions. She ended up losing Dearborn, Michigan. She ended up losing Michigan as a state. And so I guess whenever I talk about this topic, I always try to end on a positive note. And I think, and not only for the sake of it, because I actually do see a silver lining in this. And I think the silver lining is, I think that probably for the first time that I can remember, that the Arab and Muslim American voice and vote and community has now emerged as a political force, as a voice to be listened to. And, we saw that when Donald Trump went to Michigan himself and tried to court that vote in the last days of the election. And I think that if that community, if those efforts, regardless of who they're for, whether Democrat or Republican, if they continue to organize and if they continue to remain very active and engaged in the civic process, in the electoral process, in domestic politics, then they do have a chance of, in the next round of elections, in the midterms, moving forward in general, being an active, vibrant, respected community voice, political voice. And I think that would be a good thing for our democracy, for the community, and really just across the board. So that's how I try to look at it when I look at, what happens now and where do we go from here.
That's a really interesting comment. It makes perfect sense to me about values, social values, because being a tendency towards more conservative values. We always say politics are always local, and why should it not be also for Arab Americans, Muslim Americans? And I think I anecdotally, I commented earlier, I found myself in the parking lot of a mosque here in Tampa last Friday, and saw a number of Trump stickers, bumper stickers, and that did have me, now it kind of
makes sense. And I'm hypothesizing here, hypothesizing, but finding yourself in a country that you have chosen to live in, and yet the values are always shifting a little bit, right? And the perception of values are shifting, and maybe those values or perception of those values aren't what drew them to the country in the first place. So there's concern about that. That has nothing to do with foreign policy. I think that's a great, great comment.
Yeah, I mean, just
Um,
on that note, Andy, there is a British journalist. His name is Owen Jones. I'm sure you know him. Very liberal, very progressive, young voice, and he had been, like many other British journalists, had been in DC to cover the elections. And he tweeted that he was, heading back to his hotel in New York City, and his cab driver was a Pakistani Muslim, and that Pakistani American Muslim, and that he told Owen that he voted for Trump because of, the price of, I think, groceries, or, something related basically to the cost of living. And, my first instinct when I saw his tweet, and a lot of people in the comments were commenting on this, why do you assume automatically that, just because someone is Pakistani Muslim, that they would vote for the Democrats? I mean, they're American
yeah,
too. They care about cost of living. They care about social values. I mean, whether or not you agree that Trump or the Republican Party is better on those issues, of course, there's disagreement there, but
those,
that's what was at the top of his mind as an American. So I think the lesson also here is, like, let's not judge people or let's not judge a book by its cover. People, regardless of their ethnicity or their country of origin, at the end of the day, we're American, and we vote as Americans, and we may be concerned with foreign policy, and that may be the issue for some voters, but also not for others. And that shouldn't be a surprise.
yeah, again, a great point, and it applies to all groups. But I see a point about that when we come to election time, we always talk about the Latino vote and the Black vote, and although the Arab American vote is very small by comparison, that is positive. That now at least it's being courted, right? And Trump apparently Trump has even during that speech in Dearborn. I haven't seen a transcript, so I have to check my facts. But I've heard that he's even talked about appointing a Muslim member of the cabinet, which would be potentially an important gesture, if nothing more.
Yeah. He also reportedly is going to involve his daughter Tiffany's father-in-law, who's Lebanese American, in efforts to reach out to the Arab and Muslim world. And I think if what I'm reading is correct, I mean, it's still early days, that he may be replacing Amos Hochstein, who is the envoy to Lebanon, working on Israel-Lebanon issues. So, I think that, and if you remember, Andy, he also mentioned Arab Americans in his victory speech on election night. And so that's a far cry from the Donald Trump of
Yeah.
2016, when he was talking about Arabs and Muslims in this really derogatory way. Now that he has been endorsed by them, he has he has a son-in-law that is Arab. A lot of people, and of course time will tell, but a lot of people are taking all of those signs as perhaps hope that or anticipation that a second Trump term will be quite different for Arabs and Muslims than it was in the first.
That's and we keep as a host, obviously, I remain nonpartisan in this, and so I'm simply stating facts. And one of the facts that even looking at the last term, actually, fewer people died in America's wars during the last 4 years of Trump being in power. I'm talking not just Americans, but foreigners too. Fewer people died than under any other president this century. So I can't help thinking that the promise to end wars in the Middle East, although it sounds very vague, people sense maybe, I mean, there is a genuine desire to do that. And I'm only saying this, I think, probably in the same spirit that you are, is we need to look past the bombast of election and campaigning to try and, there's little point in speculating about what lies ahead. I would argue that if, Donald Trump's supporters and his opponents both agree that if he has one rock solid continuous trait, it is his lack of predictability.
That's right. That's right.
But it's,
Yeah.
it's still, it's worth reminding people who are wringing their hands right now that the last year has been awful for U.S. perception of U.S. foreign policy on the Arab street. You and I have both been involved for a long time in U.S. foreign policy, but you can remember the dark days of Abu Ghraib. Today's the 20th day of the Battle of Fallujah that I was involved in. Those were days that Americans were not looked on very well in the Middle East. And I just returned from Jordan, actually a couple of months ago, and I've got to tell you that, a country that has been always very friendly and pro-American, I sensed a lot more hostility and almost at the same level as it was during the worst days of the war.
That's right. That's right. I mean, look, I think that there has been tremendous, tremendous damage done to the image of the U.S. In the region, I would argue around the world, Andy, of course. I know we're going to hone in on the Middle East and focus on the Middle East and the Arab opinion, but I do think it's important to state that, and I say this because I always kind of push back on these, but these kind of stereotypical buckets of pro-Palestine, pro-Israel. I mean, there's also just a large contingent of people across the globe who are just pro-peace, Jews, Arabs.
Imagine that.
Muslims, I mean, they are just pro-peace. They want both Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace. They want the region to be stable and secure. They want to see international law and international norms and rules being upheld by the countries that purport to be the defenders of such international norms and rules. I mean, it's a wide spanning coalition of people who want to see justice and who believe in humanity and the protection of human life. So, with that said, I would say when it comes to the Middle East and Arabs in the Middle East, there has been huge damage done in the sense that they, and you can see this, a lot of Arab writers, and, I would urge your listeners, actually, there's a really incredible essay, and I'll try to send this to you. Maybe you can put it in the notes of this episode, an incredible article or sort of not analysis, but just commentary, I suppose, by a Lebanese writer. Her name is Lina Munzer. And she wrote an article that was shared, so widely by Arabs, by Muslims, that was essentially talking about the most difficult aspect of the last year, not physically, the most important non-physical aspect of the last year when it comes to so many Muslims and Arabs in the region, is the sense that their lives don't matter, that their lives are lesser than, and that people that they knew, people in the West, people they had considered friends or colleagues or countries they had looked up to, it was that shock of realizing, wait a minute, have you never cared about our lives? Is this something new, or has this always been the case? Have I been operating under a complete lie that you looked at me as an equal human being? Certainly, it appears that is not the case now. And that is what I think so many people in the region are grappling with. Now, of course, some people will tell you, well, we always knew that was the case because, look at what they did in Iraq and look at Guantanamo Bay and look at all these other places. For some reason, this last year has hit differently. Perhaps it's because of the scale and the enormity of what we're seeing happening in Gaza. I mean, there is a case at the International Court of Justice reviewing the Israeli war in Gaza as a plausible genocide. The International Criminal Court has requested that the court issue arrest warrants for war crimes against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant, of course, along with Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh from Hamas, who are now deceased, of course, so that doesn't really apply to them anymore. But it has been an objectively shocking level of death and destruction and war that the region has seen continuously for over a year now. And the fact that none of these Western countries that are, were such vocal defenders of human rights when it came to Ukraine, for example, who never hesitated to call out Russia's aggression, Russia's bombing of hospitals, Russian war crimes in Ukraine, now finding it seemingly impossible to do the same when it comes to Israel-Palestine. The media, the way that headlines are being written when it says, 8 Palestinians killed, or, killed by who? Like, why can't you name what is happening? Why can't you actually name it so that you can demonstrate that our lives are of equal value, and that it matters that we are being killed. We're not just dying, right? It's not a passive act. We are being killed. And so that's the sense, in the region. And speaking of Jordan, I've been to Jordan several times in the last year. And in fact, I was there the night that that Iran attacked Israel back in April. And we were supposed to be flying back to London the next night, and the airport was closed because the Jordanians had activated their air defense missiles, of course, because the Iranian missiles were flying over Jordanian territory. So it's not only that people's security around the region is also being is being affected by the war between Israel Hamas, Israel in Gaza, Israel and Iran, Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Of course, it affects the entire region, not just the parties to the conflict themselves. But also, you've seen this intense solidarity with Palestinians. I want to say re-emerge or be reactivated. It has sort of ebbed and flowed over the years, depending on what people were facing in their own countries. But we've seen that huge resurgence in pro-Palestinian sentiment across the region. We've seen very committed boycotts of places like Starbucks and McDonald's. Jordan has been the most, I would say, out of all the countries I've been to. I'm sure you've seen this when you go to Jordan. Starbucks is empty. I mean,
no one goes there.
No one goes to
right.
Starbucks.
Right there in that central mall, it's absolutely empty. It's almost embarrassing.
Empty. You walk past it, it's just the employees, and they're often hanging outside because there are no customers inside the store. McDonald's, and it's the younger generation too. It's kids 12, 13, 14 who are taking these boycotts very seriously. And so it's that younger generation as well that's growing up in this context of Israeli aggression, American support for Israeli aggression. These are all things that the younger generation is now growing up with. And I'll say one last thing about this particular phenomenon is that I think that as a result of this sort of renewed sense of purpose in supporting Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, you are finding a lot of people, there's kind of a growing schism between the government, official government responses and what the people in the street are doing. So there's been, for example, a lot of criticism in Jordan and in Egypt, the two countries that have peace treaties with Israel and, intelligence cooperation and diplomatic ties, that they haven't used that leverage, that they haven't threatened to withdraw any of that as a way to get Israel to change its behavior in Gaza or in Lebanon. You haven't seen the Egyptians you've seen the Egyptians even, I was talking to someone the other day who was criticizing President Sisi for not allowing more humanitarian assistance into Gaza on the Egyptian side. And so there's a lot of anger, I would say now, not only towards Israel and the US and Western countries, but also in some cases towards their own governments for not doing enough on their part in however they can to impact the situation in the region, in the Middle East.
Yeah, in a way, Gaza, what has happened in Gaza has really shown up. I mean, it's kind of always been the case that many governments in the Middle East, they beat their chests when it comes to the issue of Palestinians, but at heart, it doesn't seem to be a core national interest. And Egypt's a great example. Sisi obviously is a great opponent of the Muslim Brotherhood, having thrown over Morsi, and he is concerned about Brotherhood infiltration in the Egyptian army. And so I'm sure between him and his previous intelligence chief, I know they just changed intelligence chiefs, there was kind of almost a tacit, I won't say encouragement, but certainly collaboration with Israel in this. I know I'm going to say that without sounding like a conspiracist.
No, I mean, cooperation, certainly, right? Cooperation,
Yeah.
detention. The Egyptians obviously were, slash are to the extent that there's anything going on now with negotiations over the hostages, the Philadelphia corridor. I mean, the Egyptians have a stake, they're involved. I will say the one interesting development has been the impact on Saudi-Israeli normalization prospects, where that was kind of going full steam ahead before October 7th. And they were, the talks were very serious. They were at a very advanced stage, coming on the heels of the Abraham Accords and normalization with the UAE and other countries. And then, of course, October 7th put a stop to that. Now, there were reports, of course, if you remember, and I know from talking to friends of mine in the administration, that those talks were still somewhat, warm, I would say, in the very, very beginning of the war. But once it was clear that, Israel was just going all out, full on destruction, as the civilian casualties mounted, it became nearly impossible for MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, to entertain, at the very least publicly, any kind of discussion about normalization with Israel. And the Saudis over the months have become more and more vocal, more and more stringent about their requirements for restarting those talks in a serious way, talking about a recognition of a Palestinian state and Jerusalem as the capital and 1967 borders and, all of this stuff. That it has been said now publicly by MBS. It's been said by Prince Turki Al Faisal, who's no longer in government, but of course is still quite an influential figure, at least externally facing to the world. And I was at a Chatham House event in London, a public one, where he basically reiterated there is no normalization without peace, without a Palestinian state, without all of these things. And then recently, MBS, I don't remember where this was, but he basically said, straight out, he said, I cannot betray my young people in Saudi Arabia, who are absolutely against this right now. I cannot betray the young voice in the Middle East. And I can't, my hands are tied. I can't do this and I won't. And so I thought that was really fascinating as well, because one would, I think a lot of people tend to think, well, it's a monarchy. I mean, MBS can do whatever he wants. He doesn't have to listen to his people. And yet in this case, he really is. And he said so himself.
Yeah. 75% of the country are millennials, and he has been courting millennials for the last few years. So I think that makes perfect sense. Jasmine, what would you like to see the current administration, I'm going to avoid calling it lame duck, but that's essentially what it is. What would you like to see them do, between now and January? What can they accomplish at this stage?
Gosh, I mean, that's a tough one, Andy, because as you said, it's a lame duck administration. President Biden is dealing at the moment with a lot of public fallout A lot of blame being levied at him right now for Kamala Harris's loss. People coming out and saying you didn't step down early enough. You only gave her 100 days to prepare for a presidential election. This is all your fault. You're seeing leaks coming from her staff saying that this was Biden's fault. So I think he's dealing with a lot domestically right now. And I think any outgoing president, particularly one of his age, will be thinking about the legacy that they leave behind. And it's not looking good at all for Biden in terms of legacy, whether you look at the Middle East, whether you look at domestic politics. He really, 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 he really messed up by waiting to step aside for as long as he did. And I think in many ways, Kamala Harris was therefore, almost set up to fail, because how do you prepare a presidential campaign in 100 days? So he's dealing with a lot. How much effort he will put into trying to do something different in the next couple of months, I have to tell you, I can't think of, a single thing that he might do in such a short period of time. I mean, we are now coming to the deadline of this letter that he sent to Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant, who's now no longer defense minister, because Netanyahu fired him on election day, which was a great distraction in his mind as he fired his defense minister. So the Biden administration had sent this letter about 30 days ago, giving the Israeli government 30 days to reverse a lot of the policies, a lot of the actions that they had taken over the last several months that had resulted in such a dire humanitarian crisis. And I mean, even as I say that, that's such an understatement. I mean, it's a catastrophe. It's, when you hear Jan Egeland of the NRC talk, or any humanitarian organization talking about the deep level of shock based on what they've seen, what they've witnessed coming out of Gaza, their staff members who've been killed. So the Biden administration gave the Israelis 30 days to fix that to the extent that they could. And here we are coming up on the 30 days, whether anything will happen, whether there will be any consequences. When the administration released that letter publicly, they said basically that they would consider looking at security assistance to Israel and other such, levers of leverage if Israel were not to comply. So we're coming up on that. So let's see what happens. But, I think it's important to note also to your listeners, and maybe, people will know this, that, and I've talked to people again in the administration, reporters here in DC who are in touch with, who know sort of what's happening on the inside to the extent that you can know, that a lot of this policy of the Biden administration has been a very personal policy, has been a very personal issue for Biden. He is deeply committed to Israel, to Zionism, to the protection of Israel. He really sees that as a very personal issue for him, coupled with the fact that he saw a lot of parallels between what happened to the US on 9/11 and what happened to Israel on October 7th. So all of that combined led him to be sort of, by word and deed, the most pro-Israel president that I think we've ever seen, or at least recent history. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I would certainly say in recent history. And so whether or not that same president would suddenly see it necessary or fit to dramatically change course in the last 2 months of his presidency, I find it difficult to believe, so I am not holding out any hope that anything changes. We do know that Trump has told Netanyahu that he wants him to wrap this up by the time Trump is in office. I don't know how Netanyahu is going to interpret that, wrap it up as in go do as much damage as you can between now and then to make sure that, come January, you can start scaling back. I don't know, we don't know what the exact nature of that conversation was other than the headline that was released, which is wrap up this war before I'm president or by the time I'm president, because I don't want to deal with it. So, again, I don't see anything huge changing or major changing in the next couple of months. We do know that President Trump has promised to end the wars. We also know that his staff and his people, his advisors on Israel-Palestine have been some of the most extreme voices in that field, in that sort of, you have Ambassador David Friedman, who is not only, even when I talk to, Jewish or Israeli friends of mine or reporters who describe him as, the most extreme of the extreme, he's, he represents the most extreme of settler, movements and mentality and policies, which is extreme even for Israelis. So, what role will he play? Of course, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, has always been quite pro-Israel, reportedly saying that he doesn't believe in a two-state solution. You don't know exactly what he's thinking. We know that he is very concerned with economic issues, particularly vis-a-vis the Gulf. So there's a lack of clarity and there's a lot of fear around the people that Donald Trump is going to surround himself with when it comes to the Middle East. So even though he says, I want to end the wars, what I was saying the other day on Al Jazeera is, if you look at Trump's first term, and back to what you said, Andy, about fewer people dying in the region in his first term, he killed Qasem Soleimani, who caused a lot of death and destruction across the region, particularly in Syria and Lebanon. He oversaw the Abraham Accords. So people look at those things as reason to believe that Trump will be good for the region. What I caution, though, is I think that there's a difference between real peace and superficial peace. And I think that superficial peace doesn't really serve anyone in the region, including Israelis, of course, because I count them as part of the region. And so this time around, when he talks about peace in the Middle East, is he going to do the same thing that they did last time, which is focus on economic deals, ignore the Palestinian question, or is he going to actually try to enact policies that go to the heart of actual, root causes, final status issues when it comes to Israel-Palestine, issues that will in the short term be very painful, I think, for both sides to address, but that in the long term, I believe are the only chance we have at a genuinely peaceful and secure and prosperous region moving forward.
Well, Jasmine, I know we've come to an end, and that was a great, it was a great comment at the end. I just like to add, I agree with you 100% on that we're seeing, under Biden, certainly this emotional attachment to Israel, which is disturbing, regardless of administration. We want to see U.S. interests come first, of course, as Americans, and it reminds me of Kissinger. As a contrast in the, you probably remember reading about this in the Yom Kippur War, Kissinger talking to Golda Meir and reminding her, Prime Minister, I'm an American, I'm the U.S. Secretary of State, and I'm a Jew, in that order. And, yes, Golda Meir said, and that was, that was his attitude, and the attitude of the administration that was considered even then pro-Israeli, but that they always put U.S. interests first, that it's not, U.S. interests are not reflexively Israeli interests, I guess, is a reminder that it's good to remain, for all of our policymakers. You can put in Israel or any other country there.
Look, absolutely. I also think it's important, on behalf of my both Jewish and Israeli friends, and peace activists that I've been working with over the last year, they always ask me to share, this point whenever I can in the media, that also Jewish interests are not necessarily Israeli interests, and that also Israeli interests are not necessarily the Israeli government's interests. So a lot there, so much nuance there when we talk about this issue. And I think that so often assumptions are made about all of these groups, and everything tends to be lumped together like it is with Arabs and Muslims. And so I also just think it's really important to listen to, voices that represent different ideas of what, issues that matter to Jews, issues that matter to Israelis, issues that matter to pro-peace Israelis. All of these things are really issues that need to be, they're so nuanced, and it's so important to recognize that nuance and incorporate it into US policy. And of course, at the end of the day, it's exactly like you said, the US president has to think of US interests first. And then he also has to act as the leader of the free world in terms of protecting, international law, international norms and rules, as we said before, protecting human life, anywhere that we can. But at the end of the day, he's the US president, and he's going to be focused on US interests. And we'll have to wait and see how Donald Trump interprets that, and how much time he spends on foreign policy versus domestic policy, on the Middle East versus China, and of course, who his team will be, which will give us a greater understanding in terms of what may lie ahead.
Jasmine, thank you so much. And for our listeners, Jasmine's going to send me links, her Twitter, obviously her Twitter handle, but also link to MindWorks strategies and your podcast too, if you don't mind, Jasmine, or anything else you would care to share with us. I just want to say what a great discussion. Again, next time we have you on, I'd love to hear your views on radicalization and the road ahead. The last time we talked, I believe, the Irregular Warfare podcast with Nate Rosenblatt. I don't know if you remember that. It was a really fascinating discussion about the radicalization of Western Muslim youth, and the path there was to Iraq and Syria and the Islamic State. But with the world inflamed over the last year, the way I've just described, however Gaza ends in the next few months isn't going to be how Gaza ends, I think is my feeling. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I know you don't have time to talk about that now, but thank you so much.
Thanks for having me,
for coming on.
Thank you.